Hi, I'm Bill Bronchick, and in this video I'd like to discuss the delicate art of negotiating an owner financing deal, particularly where the seller wants a whole lot of money down. And of course, you want to buy with little or no money down. So how do we deal with some of those seller objections? Well, I've got 4 different ways to handle the objection of the seller wants more money down. And the first one is what I refer to as the double down. I got this from my friend, the late Barney Zick, who was a great negotiator. And what he would say was to the seller, let's say you're offering the seller 10% down, and the property needs some work, which is roughly the equivalent of that amount. And the seller says, I want more money down. So you say, well, I don't want to make a double down payment. And the seller says, what do you mean by a double down payment? He says, well, I have to put X amount in the property, and then I have to give X amount to you. That's a double down payment. So the seller, looks a little puzzled, but sort of gets your point. And how do you resolve that? Well, you resolve that by saying to the seller, listen, instead of me putting this big chunk of money down to you plus this big chunk of money to, fix up the property, if you want to make sure I have skin in the game, and that's really the objection the seller's going to have most of the time, then I'll put the money into a reserve escrow. So you have a third party, a bank or a trust company, title company, attorney who's going to hold the money in escrow. So let's say, for example, you're putting $10,000 down and putting $20,000 in repairs, and the seller says he wants another 10 or 20 down. What you do is you give the seller 10 at closing. The escrow agent will hold the additional 20, and then when you do the work, the money is released from escrow. So you're still out of pocket, let's say 30 grand, as opposed to maybe 50 grand. You have skin in the game, so you satisfy the seller, and everybody's happy in that regard. The second is what I refer to as the subordination. Now, if the seller's objection is, I need you to have more money down because I want you to have skin in the game, then, number 1 is the strategy for that, or possibly number 3, we'll get to that in a moment. But if the seller just says, I need more down because I just need more money right now, then the subordination technique can work very well. Now, typically, let's say on a $100,000 price, and you offer $10,000 down. Seller's going to carry the other 90. And that's going to be a first mortgage on the property or first deed of trust on the property, and you'll be the owner of the property of the deed. So if the seller says, well, I need $30,000 down, and you don't want to put, of course, $30,000 down, you say to the seller, look, I'll give you that $30,000 down instead of the 10. But the other $70,000 note is going to be collateralized with a second mortgage on the property. He's going to subordinate to a new first mortgage. And that new first mortgage is where you're going to get the $30,000. So let's say you went to a hard money lender or a private money lender or a relative or friend who can lend you $30,000 on a $100,000 property, which shouldn't be a risky proposition at all. You should be able to negotiate a reasonable interest rate. And then you give that borrower a note and a lien, mortgage or deed of trust as a first on the property. You take that $30,000 and then you give it to the seller, so the seller gets his $30,000 at closing. But then the $70,000 that the seller's carrying, this note is going to be secured by a second lien, deed of trust or mortgage on the property. So after closing, the title will be in your name. There'll be a first mortgage to the private money lender, and there'll be a second $70,000 mortgage to the seller. That's what we refer to as a subordination. And again, it's not going to work if the seller wants you to have more skin in the game, because in this case you have no skin in the game. You're all borrowed. But if the seller just needs more money and he's willing to subordinate the balance, if you give him a bigger chunk down, then this is a very viable strategy. Number 3, prepay. So back to the first scenario, seller says, you're only putting $10,000 down, and I don't really feel comfortable because I want you to have more skin in the game, or you're only putting 5% down, or maybe your offer has nothing down. How do you satisfy that objection? Well, if you give the seller more down, you're not going to see that money back for a while until you sell or refinance the property. But so instead, you say to the seller, listen, I'll give you 6 months or maybe even a year's worth of payments up front on the property. And that way, you know, if you make, let's say, 12 payments up front and then you turn around and rent the property, you're going to get those payments back over the next 12 months in terms of rent, as opposed to giving a chunk of a down payment, which you won't see again for a long, long time until you sell or refinance the property. So prepaying payments, and by the way, if you do prepay payments, ask for a discount. So if you make 6 months worth of payments in advance, you get a 5 or 10% discount on those payments. If you offer a year in advance, maybe you get a 20% discount. Work that a little bit, negotiate. And the last one that we're going to work on today is additional collateral. So if the seller says, you know, you're not putting much down here, I need some security that you're going to pay, you can put a deed of trust on another property that you have that has some equity and cross-collateralize. So there'll be one note, but there'll be two mortgages or two deeds of trust recorded against the subject property you're buying and another property that you own, maybe even your principal residence, if you dare, or another, you know, property, residential or commercial that you have. Maybe even you could even pledge a mortgage on a piece of raw land that may appraise for $15,000 or $20,000. Might not really be worth that, but at least, you know, in theory, it's got a stated appraisal value that you can show to the seller that can be cross-collateralized with the deal. So these are just 4 techniques. There's a whole lot more of them. If you'd like more information on some of the negotiating tactics and other strategies for owner financing, visit the store on LegalWiz.com. And I hope you enjoy and put to good use these strategies for negotiating owner financing deals.